Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. Welcome to this live stream on phenomenology, the natural attitude, and the phenomenological reduction. This is a tremendous grouping of topics, I would say, for phenomenology. I've had previous videos about the natural attitude, the basic steps of phenomenology, but now I want to concentrate on what is meant by the phenomenological reduction, or also called bracketing in Greek, the epoche in phenomenology, or we say reduction. So, first of all, again, what's being reduced is the natural attitude. What's meant by the natural attitude is some kind of reductionistic thinking about things, or a reduced perception of phenomena that are giving themselves to the human subject. So the phenomenological reduction is very important, and part of the first step for doing phenomenology is to know what is this reduction, how do you employ it, and what is being reduced in order to then receive the givenness of phenomena. So I want to talk a bit about this, and in order to do so, I'm going to make reference to some texts from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, foreword by Jean-Luc Marion. The first chapter of this book involves introducing phenomenology to the reader in a more sophisticated way than just the basics. And one of the sections in chapter 1 is entitled The Phenomenological Reduction. So I would like to share some of this text and elucidate it, comment on it, in order to help our understanding about what is meant by this phenomenological reduction and how does it work. So again, phenomenology begins by executing the reduction, the epoche. And again, let me share my screen and give some more language around this meaning of the phenomenological reduction. Okay, so I'm going to just give some vocabulary, some nomenclature to help understand this better. Phenomenological reduction. Again, the Greek word is epoche, which essentially means suspension or bracketing, holding in suspense. And also we could say reducing. And just to make the word similar, suspending, bracketing, reducing, epoche in phenomenology. And I have this background of beautiful flowers because when the natural attitude, perception comes to life all the more. It's a beautiful thing, really. What payoff this has in practical living, this phenomenological reduction. So often in life, we can get worked up about things that we assume to be the case. Something like the world is out to get me, something like I'll never get ahead, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, I'm behind the 8 ball, all these expressions we have to say I'm in a bad place, I can't get out, a kind of B.F. Skinner determinism mentality of things. Phenomenology says no, we have to bracket all of this. Something like determinism is a fallacy because possibility is not determined. It's open. It's open to something new, wonderful, surprising, all the time. Even The little overcoming of a challenge. This is a real possibility and a welcome one for us when we are beset by challenges and difficulties in life. So the epoche, the suspending, the bracketing, the reducing of the natural attitude also implies reducing of the natural attitude or judgment too. Uh, Making a definitive judgment about the state of affairs of the world, making a definitive judgment, claiming to know what is the case. All of this is bracketed, suspended. All of this is held in suspense. These reductionisms are reduced through the phenomenological reduction. So, this is the great paradox that phenomenology begins with, is sustained with, and I would say ends with, but it doesn't end as part of the paradox. It's like the virtue of humility. You never arrive at being perfectly humble. The virtue itself is paradoxical, and so is love, and so is faith, and hope, all the rest. But that it's something that has to continue to live, continue to grow, continue to expand. And the problem we have for philosophy is we fall into reductionistic thinking and we stay there and we get stuck there. And our worldview becomes very calloused, hardened, locked in, you could say, and we can't really move forward. We become paralyzed within a kind of ideological framework of one kind or another, some kind of ism. Again, idealism, scientism, materialism, atheism, empiricism, rationalism, fideism, fundamentalism. There's all these different isms that as human beings can get caught up in. And why are we attracted to these isms, all of which are reductionisms? Because they're easier to deal with, to live with, to think through. We think we get this pretension that we're in control of things when we live according to these reductionistic worldviews. But instead, the phenomenological reduction works to reduce the reductionism. And when you reduce the reductionism, we have an expansion of thought, an expansion of perception. And this is what we want. This is what we want for philosophy. Because we want to be committed to thinking toward the whole, to open toward the whole, to reverently allow the whole to approach us in thought. This is the paradigm shift that must take place if one is to do phenomenology, and I would argue to do philosophy well at all. So the phenomenological reduction involves this epoche, a suspension, bracketing, reducing of the natural attitude or premature, predetermined judgments about things, judgment about the state of affairs. Phenomenology suspends judgment deliberately and is simply open to what gives itself methodologically. This is what it's doing. It wants to receive what gives itself. And judgment, if you make a judgment in advance about what could give itself, what has already given itself, then you closed off to what might give itself, what may come, what may happen. And the truth about lived experience is that it's open possibility. It's open possibility. And I'll say even early on in talking about this that we're not talking about arbitrary possibilities, but we're talking about authentic possibilities. So, for example, the possibilities of love. It's not random, and promiscuity is not possibility. It's actually a closure of possibility when it comes to love between persons. And we could get into how this is the case. But possibility is a movement of the gift that is genuine, sincere, and authentic, and free. It's free. It's not trapped. Phenomenology, in terms of phenomenological possibility in relation to desire, allows desire to find footing, to find direction, and to find fulfillment. In the end of fulfillment, that is a satisfaction, but continues to open to greater satisfaction. The difference between felicity and beatitude, in terms of the Latin concepts for happiness, not just temporary satisfaction and happiness that comes in and goes out, but an approach toward beatitude and the full flowering of possibility that will involve divinity. So this is so exciting. Phenomenological reduction, reducing the reductionism. We have to begin here. Again, I'm taking from my 2017 book, the section of phenomenological reduction, to talk about this. Husserl introduces the term when he begins the method of phenomenology, and yet among the most helpful pages that illuminate the meaning of the phenomenological reduction and its evolution since its original use with Husserl are those at the end of Jean-Luc Marion's book called Reduction and Givenness. Marion concludes his study of the phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger by summarizing what he sees to be their respective versions of the phenomenological reduction and then claiming to add his own third reduction. And so I'd like to talk in this live stream about the three reductions of Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion, and then a fourth, that of Emmanuel Levinas, and then a fifth, Marion's erotic reduction. So hopefully we can get through all of this in an hour. We'll try. But Marion understands his own work to be in definite continuity between that of Husserl and Heidegger. And so we want to recall again the meaning of the reduction for the method of phenomenology to describe phenomena as they give themselves, or I like to say themselves, speak themselves, signify themselves within human experience. Experience as Erlebnis in German rather than Erfahrung. So I want to talk about these two terms here. The distinction we have in German phenomenology between Erlebnis and Erfahrung. So first, Erlebnis, and then second, we will go to Erfahrung. Okay, so what is each of these? Erlebnis, Erfahrung, Erlebnis. Let's start with Erfahrung. Erfahrung in German, the sense of a transversal or finding out something. Erfahrung. Transversal or finding out. What more can we say about that? Erfahrung. But Erfahrung refers to an experience of one having the natural attitude. So Erfahrung is not a phenomenological experience. It's the general, generic, typical experience without the phenomenological reduction. Regarding reality as a totality of objects that can be known through something like natural science alone, the scientific method, a kind of empirical experience. And so you find something out according to your predetermined categories to situate that new datum that you receive in the experiment. But everything is managed, manipulated, measured, dominated by the human subject in Erfahrung. Erfahrung can be very efficient with things, but it is not contemplative and it is not phenomenological. So Erlebnis, on the other hand, refers to the experience of the phenomenologist who always is open to the adventure of possibility. In particular, Erlebnis refers to the lived inner experiences of that which is immanent to consciousness, as Husserl talks about, and all possible meanings thereof. So Erlebnis involves the bracketing of the natural attitude, and it's a kind of experience that is open to the adventure of possibility, and especially it's referring to the immanent intuition of interior consciousness, Erlebnis, allowing phenomena to give themselves all the way into the heart of consciousness, and in a sense to form a unity between the thing in itself and conscious life. And it's an amazing experience that's going on here, to be able to form a delightful unity between the given and the self, to appreciate the given like this as gift. Erlebnis is a kind of experience that happens when the phenomenological reduction takes place, and virtually everything, not saying everything, but virtually everything is received as gift, because there can be very negative experiences deficient of the meaning of the gift in life. So it's not to say that everything is authentic that we experience, but it is to be a watchman of the gift, Erlebnis. Whereas Erfahrung, it's a transversal, it's a finding out as efficiently and expediently as possible according to the natural attitude, and definite judgments going on all the time. It is a kind of approach to things that where the self is Lord of the universe, yes. Whereas Erlebnis, it's more of a question. Again, what gives this phenomenological reduction, Erlebnis? So in order to go beyond the natural attitude that predetermines phenomena before they are experienced, and then would set fixed boundaries within which a phenomenon may give itself, a reduction must be enacted that explicitly names and sets aside all predeterminations that may in effect distort the originality and integrity of a phenomenon and curtail, mitigate possibility. In other words, not to come clean with pre-given worldviews and presumed restrictions of the possible is to perceive according to a set of assumptions that altogether may not, after all, be the case. So the reduction, the phenomenological reduction, the epoche, the bracketing, conscientiously identifies any a priori barriers to possibility and then brackets them. That is to say, the reduction pierces through the temptation of a premature act of judgment and opens to any and all phenomenal saying, signifying, or giving, showing. In essence, the reduction permits phenomenologists to ask with great sincerity, what gives? What signifies? How does it give or signify? Because again, phenomenology is about receptivity to meaning and signification above all. Again, what are some examples of this? The meaning of anticipation of something that I look forward to later in the day, coming up. On the horizon, we say. What's on the horizon of experience? That anticipation itself is a givenness, the sense of anticipation. I could use some other words to describe it. Hope. Um, um, we say, I look forward to this or that. Uh, I'm eagerness, eagerness, hopefulness, anticipation. These are phenomenological essences that give themselves within lived experience. And so I let them give themselves. I don't fold my arms at the day and say there's nothing new under the sun. It's going to be boring. It's not going to be interesting. Someone's going to betray me again. Someone's going to let me down. I'm going to let myself. This is Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. This is cloudy and only cloudy, and as if cloudy is not interesting. For phenomenology, everything is interesting. I would go so far even to say, even dealing with a tragic or traumatic experience in life is pregnant with the possibility of hope, of healing, of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of trust. That not all is lost, not all is destroyed. So in this way, there's always a gospel message through the whole of life, through the thick of life, no matter what is going on. And this is huge. This is huge. Not just how to cope with something, but how to hope through something. And so we're going to find in phenomenology that many of the most interesting meanings come with theology, with religious experience, with this kind of excess terminology that refers to limit experiences in life. That is to say, we come up upon a limit, but there's this potential for something to burst forth within the finitude of experience. And this is what happens when we understand the phenomenological reduction and we practice exercising it in life. And I don't say this as some like self-help recipe for success, for a kind of superficial happiness or something. I say this in the name of truth, that the self, when we analyze the self, stands in need of ongoing conversion away from the lie and toward the truth, because it stands to reason that we're either dealing with truth, and if we're not dealing with truth, it's a lie. So philosophy wants to go to the threshing floor and separate out truth from lies, reality from illusion. And we do this by exercising the phenomenological reduction. We're going to the threshing floor of truth, and we're pounding the chaff so that the kernels of wheat can come forth and we can gather them up and set the chaff aside. This is what phenomenology is after, the essential kernels of lived experience. Erlebnis, the German concept here. So to get at this, to get at the kernels, we have to get through the husk, and the way we do that is the phenomenological reduction. Because someone could look at an ear of corn with all the husk and not believe there's any kernels in there. But we have to peel the husk away and get to the kernels, the phenomenological reduction. So phenomenological description must proceed with great caution so as not to fall too quickly back into preset judgments of what is the case, that is, what has been actualized already experienced already, as if there's nothing new to experience, as if every experience is only comparable or relatable to a past one. The beauty of experience is something can happen and I've never experienced before. In fact, that's what's happening right now for you and for me, and through the medium of this video um, or this audio, that we're experiencing something new for the first time, and it's reminding us that this is the case with all experience. So, phenomenology is open always to possibility, confined neither to a subjunctive outlook. For example, if that were would, should, could, ought, must, let, may, nor to a conditional outlook. For example, if were would, could, will, might. Rather, phenomenology outstrips the limitations of linguistic, social, historical, cultural convention in order to render the phenomenon its due, in order to respect the rights of the phenomenon to give itself as it gives itself. The phenomenon's right to give or signify, show itself, rather than only under the arbitrary conditions that we may permit it to give or say itself. Phenomenology's power is in its openness, honesty, and willful naivete, asking what gives, what signifies, what lights up this experience. I mean, something I'm just thinking about is when it comes to good news, to test good news, we might test it with worst case scenarios. And we could say, yeah, that's really bad. That would be devastating. That would be the end. That would ruin the good news. But with phenomenology, there's always a glimmer of hope. And so the goodness of phenomenology can be tested, can be put to the test every time. And no matter how difficult the situation, phenomenology reminds us, yet there's this one more possibility coming up on the horizon. Live into it. Believe in it. Welcome it. Be hospitable to possibility, and it will not let you down. It will keep giving you life. And as we continue to discuss these things, we're going to get into the heights of possibility in terms of descriptively qualitative different kinds of possibility, and we're going to move toward the things like love and responsibility, interpersonal phenomena, and there's such a richness here. If we do not let ourselves be convinced that this life is matter in motion and that is all, that this universe is populated with objects and that is all. No, there are objects and there are things, phenomena beyond the object. And we want to gather these up. We want to get at these. So, the weakness, though, of phenomenology, all this being said, is its inherent recognition of the immense possibilities of the task it sets before itself. Phenomenology is voluminous. Phenomenology, there's no ends in sight, but that's also a blessing. It's again welcoming the present moment, welcoming the advent of every moment, and not being fatigued in that there's so much receiving to do, there's so much describing to do, there's so much ethical responsibility at stake, not being overwhelmed by all of this. And that's why when we go back to Husserl's principle of principles, and he ends it by saying, if we receive all that offers itself, gives itself originarily as a living intuition and experience, but not beyond the limits in which the phenomenon gives itself. So it's okay to admit that we are finite persons, human subjects after all. Um, but, again, it's like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, um, Bilbo Baggins, Frodo Baggins, the Baggins. Gandalf comes and says, I have an adventure for you. And Baggins is like, no thanks, I'm good. I'm content in my hobbit hole. But it's when there's that conversion and that virtue pours in, that courage, that tenacity, that perseverance, that determination, and you evacuate the hobbit hole and live. It's when the world really lights up. And you trust in the alterity of the elsewhere that gave yourself to yourself in the first place and in every place. For phenomenology, the beginning is the end because the end is the beginning. Marion has a beautiful quote about this in his book on St. Augustine, In the Self's Place, where he writes, running does not have as its goal attaining what precedes, so as to nullify the advance. This is why I studied with the man. It's brilliant. It's incredible philosophy. But he's using the metaphor of running. And when you run, you don't look behind you. You run straight ahead. You press on toward the goal. Running doesn't have its goal what already happened, so as to nullify the advance, what's coming on the horizon, but to put me too in the advance itself. Marion used to be a runner, by the way, so when he uses this metaphor, he has firsthand experience. He also told me once he got to ride on the back of the leader car for the Tour de France, and so he's sitting and watching the cyclists come up right behind him, and it was a wonderful spot for contemplation. The cyclists, because they're running, they're part of the advance, but he was looking back on them and contemplating their moving into the advance. So in any case, he says to run, I must in effect constantly put myself in a disequilibrium, put myself into the advance itself, the advance of the phenomenon, the advance of the coming, the advent of the moment. And the happiness of running the race consists in remaining permanently in the unbalanced advance. It's the difference between the hobbit hole and the adventure. There's a disequilibrium. There's an unpredictability. There's risk. There's unbalance. And the key is to remain serene in the fray, to have balance in a perpetual, unbalanced advance of the coming of the phenomenon. So, again, the happiness of running the race consists in remaining permanently in the unbalanced advance, perfectly and continually free from the permanence and stability. We could add security, self-insulation. We forfeit this idol in order to be looked upon by the iconography of the advance. To use Marion's distinction between the idol and the icon, he talks about elsewhere. Because permanent stability, security, the hobbit hole is illusory. Anyway, he says, of a nuke stance. It's not real. One time I asked Marion about fame, and right away he said to me, it's not real. And I continued to ponder what he meant by that. Another time he explained more what he meant by saying it's not real. And it's true. Fame, wealth, health, power, honor, esteem, accolades, all these things, there's an emptiness there. Once I was speaking with a cardiologist, a medical doctor, and he had built his own house. He had all this money, and he built his own house, got it built. He didn't build it; he hired people to build it. But it was a beautiful mansion, and I was in it before. We spent time together, listening to music and talking, and it was great. But he told me that after his house was complete, he sat there alone in his house and felt empty. So interesting. And you hear this story a lot in relation to money, things money can buy. That there's a hollowness there, and a desires reaching for something that's not real. It's not there, and so it is with like permanent stability, security, um, the idolatry of private property. Not to get political or anything. There's a metaphysical goodness about private property, but the idolatry of it, the idolatry of my cash, my bank account, my stuff, as if that's the point of life. And these philosophers, Levinas goes after this, Marion goes after this, the Spinozan conatus essendi is not an absolute. So, what is this conatus essendi? What is Marion getting at here? What is Levinas getting at here? The conatus essendi is the struggle for being, um, you could say, yes, the battle for existence, uh, that we can become so preoccupied about, and yes, we all have to earn food by the sweat of our brow and engage in different kinds of work. But there can be the nearby idolatry of work, of consumption, of self-preservation, this conatus essendi. And phenomenology is saying there's more that's giving itself than these things here. And we get frozen in idolatry. We get paralyzed by the head of Medusa. So what Marion is getting at is the advance. In this book, In the Self's Place, he goes on to say, if God inspires the desire in me, it is not first to fulfill it by satisfying it, but to fulfill it by hollowing it with achievements that become so many new beginnings. So we have a paradox of hollowness. There's a hollowness that comes with possession, that there's no new beginning once possessed. It's done. It's finalized and oftentimes paralyzed. The toys sit there in the garage, in the storage unit. I find that an interesting phenomenon too, like all these storage units, and we pay money to store our stuff in places we don't even go most of the time. And yet, there's a paradox about hollowness, because there's a hollowness Marion is talking about with the achievement of the advance that satisfies to the degree that it opens for a further achievement. Not in an idolatrous trophy sense, but in the sense of the advance of the phenomenon in authenticity comes to open us further to possibility and the circulation of possibility. So there's a dispossession that needs to happen, which does happen through exercising the phenomenological reduction. We're dispossessing ourselves of ourselves. We're saying, I'm not at the helm of the ship of experience after all. We'll get more into this. Theologian, philosopher, phenomenologist, in some ways, David Tracy, in his book Dialogue with the Other, talks about this. And he says, we are driven to perfect our creations, our language. We are driven, wherever we begin in theology, to God terms. As one of my professors at Loyola University Chicago said, God created us, and then we returned the favor. And I love how she said that, because it's so true. We anthropomorphize God with all of our concepts and images and pictures. Let me draw you a picture of God. It's like, yeah, right. It's not, you can draw it, you can say it. As St. Augustine said, si comprehendis non est Deus. If you comprehend it, it is not God. So David Tracy is getting at this here. We're driven wherever we begin to God terms, to God talk, to theological language and concepts. The basic necessity, he says, for the symbolic animal, which we are, so to speak, is to learn negatives, to create and not stop. Perfection is our telos, which seems to mean paradoxically that end is origin. So when it comes to the approach of God, the question is, who is approaching who? How does God approach the human subject, the creature? How does the creature approach the creator? And phenomenology is going to take note of all of these different aspects, the structure of the mutual approach, and what Marion calls the crossing of gazes in a very iconographic sense. So that's what we're getting into here with this phenomenological reduction. And maybe for now, I will just talk more about Husserl's reduction, and maybe save another time to talk about Heidegger's reduction, Marion's reduction, Levinas's reduction, because there's a bit to say about these. But the first version of the phenomenological reduction is that of Husserl, namely what has become known as the transcendental reduction. And Marion describes Husserl's reduction in his book Reduction and Givenness as amounting to a constitution of objects. So already Marion is pointing out that Husserl's reduction has its benefits, but also its limits. It tends to be overly objective in the sense of using that language and regarding the thing in itself in its concrete fleshly objectivity. And this is important. It is the first step of the whole procedure of the understanding the reduction. We need to start with the objects because it's what's most near at hand, most easy to use as an example, and to go from there. So this is called Husserl's reduction, the transcendental reduction, because in reference to the transcendental I, so the I, the ego, is transcendental. Transcendental subjectivity, thinking about Immanuel Kant, really defining this term, and even going back to Descartes, the transcendence of the ego in relation to the object, the one dealing with all these objects, and yet the ego that eludes itself in its self-transcendence. But the transcendental reduction in phenomenology is deployed for the intentional and constituting I, and gives to the I, the ego, constituted objects. So that's the payoff in phenomenology with Husserl's reduction. we do get to the things themselves, though at a rudimentary level where it must begin, because there's many phenomena that are not objects. Again, ideas, feelings, sounds, sensations, the flesh giving itself to itself. So phenomenology has run with Husserl's reduction and taken it to new levels, new places. And there's a deficiency about Husserl's transcendental reduction in that Marion says it excludes from givenness everything that does not let itself be led back to objectivity per se. And there's an oversimplification in philosophy in this polemical distinction between realism and idealism, as if realism just deals with objectivity and idealism just deals with subjectivity. And they're opposed and they're in competition. For phenomenology at this point in its development, uh, these terms are all too limiting. We will begin with the commitment to objectivity, but we may talk about the objectivity of subjectivity, for example. And this language is incomplete in itself, even in relation to the concept of truth. Somebody who already has a predetermined grammar between objectivity and subjectivity, okay, to set them at ease, we'll talk about the objectivity of truth. Yes, but truth is more than objectivity. There's other language we can use, we can find to talk about truth as it gives itself, as it signifies itself, like givenness. Givenness is a better term, I'm making a metaphysical judgment there, than objectivity. Because the problem with the term objectivity is the word object is in there. And so am I going to talk about the objectivity of the person? I risk treating the person like an object. So I can talk about the objectivity of a fact in as much as it's real. But phenomenology is that let's get at the wellspring of the genesis, the germination, the generation of the thing in itself. Something is happening even before the phenomenon is constituted as an object. But Husserl had to begin there in order to let what he's saying land on legibility, that people would understand what he's saying. But Marion's critiquing Husserl decades later and saying that the transcendental reduction does not open effectively to all possible forms of givenness as well as it could. For example, those forms of givenness that are not objects but nonetheless give themselves, such as consciousness itself, the world as such, time. There's so many phenomena, affectivity, that are not objects. And so if we want to talk about the thing in itself always as a constituted object, we could fall into another kind of reductionism of objectivity. So the phenomenological reduction, this is the great paradox. The phenomenological reduction must always be about reducing itself. How does that happen? The phenomenological reduction lets itself be perfected by different phenomenologists and the different developments of the method over time. And so we have Heidegger reducing Husserl's reduction. We have Marion reducing Heidegger's reduction. We have Levinas, I will argue later, reducing Marion's reduction anachronistically from the grave, you could say. We'll talk more about these. It gets more and more interesting as we go in the history of phenomenology and see how the phenomenological reduction itself does not stay static, but continues to grow and develop all the way to the point of, yes, this theological turn, especially in French phenomenology, and where that's at today. So the second variation of the reduction indicated by Marion is that of Heidegger, which Marion refers to as the existential or ontological reduction. And this reduction of Heidegger is called existential or ontological in that it sets itself into operation through the existing being, Dasein. And it is ontological in that it works the question of being, the Seinsfrage, the Seinssinn, the question of being and the question of meaning or sense, signification. It sets this in motion, Marion says. So Heidegger, his breakthrough development in being in time, Sein und Zeit, is that he's bringing in a new brand of ontology against traditional ontology, against what he calls ontotheology and classical metaphysics. But he's reawakening the Seinsfrage, the question of being. Heidegger is doing this with the help of Husserl's phenomenological reduction. And so for Heidegger, the main theme is the self-revelation of Sein, of being, through Seiende, through beings, and to the Dasein, the human subject. And it's a beautifully poetic, well-fashioned philosophical project. Heidegger's Being in Time. Yes, it's its own chapter in the history of Western philosophy, let alone phenomenology. So it's this existential ontological reduction of Heidegger. Marion, though, critiques it too and says it's deficient in that it excludes from possibility that which does not have to be, in particular, the preliminary conditions of the phenomenon of being, of Sein. So Marion, if you follow his work, this is something that he's always doing, is critiquing the privilege of ontology in philosophy. And so he publishes a book in French, Dieu sans l'être, God without being. What do you mean? God without being. If God has no being, God doesn't exist, right? Marion says there's a more interesting question about God than God's existence. And it's something like God's coming, God's revelation. We need to investigate, we need to explore philosophically these theological possibilities in a way, Marion says, beyond classical metaphysics. We can't reduce everything to metaphysical categories all the time because metaphysics itself does not have the aptitude, the tools to investigate God is love sufficiently, according to the principle of sufficient reason. So Marion critiques Husserl's reduction as risking reducing everything to objectivity. He critiques Heidegger's reduction as reducing everything to being in itself revelation. And it continues to play into the idolatry of being and all of its nearby concepts. So the restrictions of Husserl's objectivity, we also find in ontology, is not open entirely to possibility either, nor does it get at the most anterior aspect of phenomenality. For Marion's analysis, there is a more originary and absolute layer of phenomenality beyond being and the ways that it is disclosed. And for phenomenology, in Marion's work, the concept that Marion prioritizes and gives all the primacy is givenness itself. So for Marion, it's not givenness for the sake of the object. It's not, as in Husserl, it's not givenness for the sake of being, as in Heidegger. It's givenness for its own sake in Marion. And if we want to say for the sake of anything besides givenness for the sake of the gift, the self-revelation of the gift, the given phenomenon, not restricted to categories and taxonomy of being or objects. In Marion, it seems his favorite phenomenon that he likes to investigate is the paradox. Because with a paradox, we have something that transgresses any ready-to-go categories to situate this new episode of givenness. Paradox is like a wet bar of soap. You can't hold it in your hand and get away with it. It's going to slip out. It's going to fall to the ground. It's going to slip from one hand to the other. So for Marion, the paradox is a privileged phenomenon of investigation because it will exceed Husserl's phenomenological reduction to objectivity. It will exceed Heidegger's existential ontological reduction to being and its self-manifestation, to Dasein. But Marion's third reduction is where he says, so much reduction, so much givenness. So we could summarize this by thinking about, thinking about Husserl and Heidegger's reductions and sum them up. Here, Husserl, his reduction, Husserl, a kind of motto for Husserl could be something like so much reduction, so much objectivity. For Heidegger, so much reduction, so much Sein, being, self-revelation of being to Dasein. That's why it's existential, ontological in character. But for Marion, so much reduction, so much givenness, Gegebenheit, Donation, so much giving, so much gift. You see how the reduction is more radicalized over time, from Husserl to Heidegger to Marion. With someone like Merleau-Ponty, we might say so much reduction, so much perception. With someone like Michel Henry, we might say so much reduction, so much manifestation, so much life. With Levinas, we'll talk about Levinas in our next live stream. And with Levinas, it'll be so much reduction, so much responsibility, so much call of the other, so much responsibility for the other, so much ethics. So a complete package, we could say, of phenomenology is all of the above. And so if we're doing phenomenology at this stage of the game in 2024 and 21st century, we need to know all of these layers to do it well. There's, we can fall into this thing in scholarship where we have a kind of myopic vision of what we're looking at. And so someone might specialize in Husserl and they, go about phenomenology like Husserl, and it takes you so far and it opens up a certain range. And then someone may specialize in Heidegger, and for them, they go along with Heidegger, and it gives you a bit more range. And then Marion, it gives you a bit more range. And then Levinas, I will argue, Levinas gives a bit more range. And so, where's the method going next? This is a great question for phenomenology. And who are the contributors to these developments? In terms of, yes, it's forming a kind of meta-narrative of the history of phenomenology. We can't do otherwise. But the point here is, again, to think toward the whole and to do phenomenology most effectively, for lack of a better word, or precisely, contemplatively, better. We want to be informed by all of these voices, all of these thinkers, all of their work. And when we are, that horizon is just dilating to the highest degree. Again, the advance is primary. And Marion used that beautiful metaphor I talked about earlier about running. And phenomenology is a running toward the advance of the advent of the phenomenon. If I run, I don't look to the side and run sideways. I don't backpedal. I run toward what is already running to me. And the beautiful etymology of the word God in Greek, theos, means the one who runs. And this is why God is such a privileged phenomenon to investigate for phenomenology, because of how God runs. How God runs. And when we learn how God runs through God's revelation, say Christianity, for example, we see, we learn, we discover, we hear, we perceive how God runs in a very personal way, in a very intimate way, yet transcendent way. How God runs. And then through theology, it's like we learn to run as creatures based on studying the pace and the stride of the Creator. Oh, that's a good note to end on. So again, the majority of this video taken from text in my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, an Etude in Phenomenology, forward by Jean-Luc Marion, and talking about the phenomenological reduction. And we did make it through, especially today, talking about the natural attitude, talking about Husserl's transcendental reduction, Heidegger's existential ontological reduction, Marion's donative reduction, the reduction to givenness and gift. And next live stream, I'd like to continue the discussion and talk about more about Marion's donative reduction and how he borrows from Levinas's vocative reduction, and then move into Marion's erotic reduction and back to Levinas' vocative reduction, and see where that takes us. Thanks so much for joining me on this live stream, and we'll see you in the next one.